You guys ready? We got a lot of Bible reading to do. We're going to go here into our third part of this series on Led to Become, the book of Judges. Yeah, Led to Become, the book of Judges. We're going to finish all of chapter 2 today, and we're going to get all the way up to verse 6 of chapter 3. This completes the introduction or the introductory portion of the book. You ready? We good? If no one needs that one, Ezra, you can go ahead and put it down. It's up to you. Or you can grab some colors. All right. I'm going to read. Mikhailo, you ready to go on the clicker? Judges chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you out of Egypt, and I led you into the land I had promised to your ancestors. I also said, I will never break my covenant with you. You are not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You are to tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed me. What have you done? Therefore, I now say, I will not drive out these people before you. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a trap for you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these words to all the Israelites, the people wept loudly. So they named that place Bochim and offered sacrifices there to the Lord. So we remember all of chapter 1 was a quick review of the conquest that had happened in the land. And we know that it wasn't thorough. It wasn't to what God had said and what he had expressed to the Israelites that he had wanted them to do. They instead did their own thing. And so here, the angel of the Lord comes up and says, this is what I asked you to do. This is what you did. Nothing. In fact, he just said, what did you do? It's a rhetorical question because they know what they did. And says, because of that, I'm not going to drive them out. They're going to be a thorn in your side. They're going to continue to live in the land that you were supposed to have. Do you have a question?
Why didn't everyone?
Can we do it at the end? Okay. Probably because I'm up here and I'm not a very good singer, even though it's my last name. So when you read this here and it says angel, don't think like big feathery angel. Now, all you kids, you know that when you read the Bible stories in the Bible books, typically like they have the angel and they've got like wings behind them, right?
Yeah.
It's because they draw them all the way that they're sort of pictured in the book of Revelation. But that's not the way angels look all the time. And in fact, this word here that's used for angel, it doesn't actually even mean the same thing as like those cherubims that we've seen in Revelations. This really means messenger. In fact, the word that's used here is the same word used to describe the prophets of God. And in fact, this same word is used interchangeably with God himself. So that the identity of the messenger and of God are very intertwined in the Old Testament, which makes great sense when we see in the New Testament Jesus saying, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. There's a lot of different ideas on what this messenger could have been, but suffice it to say, this is God speaking to his people, and they, of course, react in tears. Mikhailo, if you would go, can you go to the next slide for a second? I'm not sure where the fill in the blank comes in. Okay, so leave that up there, right there. So when he talks to them, this is what he reminds them. This is what I said to do. Don't make covenants with the Canaanites and tear down the altars to their false gods. That's what he said. Do those two things. These two things I've asked you to do. So he reminds them of that, and he reminds them of their vow. Remember when they vowed to him saying, if you would deliver this into our hands, we will destroy it and give it back to you. And he said, you haven't done that. You haven't gone in to take the land, so it hasn't been given to you. You've broken your vow, or that law of harem that we talked about last week. And he now says, because of what they have not done, he's not going to drive out the people. Go to the next slide there for me, Mikhailo. So he said, don't make covenants of them. And so because of that, they did make covenants, they're going to be now a thorn in your side. He said, tear down their altars. They didn't. Therefore, their gods are now going to be a snare to them. So the 2 commandments he gave them, because they didn't fulfill them, their punishment was directly equated to what they did not do. If you had have driven them out, they wouldn't be a thorn in your side. But because you didn't, they will. So it's a very much so that because you get the same thing. It's not the judgment that comes back on them for breaking their vow is actually quite proportional to what they didn't do. You remember that from when we talked about the law of God and how he deals with human beings. He doesn't punish us in a way that's disproportionate. The gods of the near ancient world typically would, right? If you hurt a rich man's cow, he would kill you, and that was okay. That's not okay in Old Testament law. That's disproportionate. But what they're receiving here is a punishment proportionate to their error. He didn't wipe them off the face of the earth. He didn't just kill them all. He didn't burn half of them alive or anything crazy like this, because that's not the kind of a God he is. But he said, if you will not drive them out, they're going to be a thorn in your side. And so because of that, we still get to see and understand God's justice and righteousness. He's still a merciful God. Even though he brought them into this place, and they didn't earn it, he wasn't going to disproportionately punish them because of their breaking their vow and breaking their covenant. This is abnormal. I mean, if you break a covenant with a king, what do you expect to have happen? Death. A lot of times, right? That's even that saying, don't kill the messenger, right? Don't shoot the messenger. That's what they used to do a lot. If the messenger came and brought bad news, they'd get angry and they'd kill him. It's disproportionate. That's not God's character. That's not who he is. So the name of this place is now, can you go to the next slide, Mikalo? I want to see what we have there. Yeah, so some of the stuff didn't come through. Go back one. And that's okay. I'll deal with that. This place, they called it Bohim, which means weeping. So they've called it a place of weeping. This didn't actually become the name of the city. It's just now what they referred to it as, the place of weeping. In fact, it's possible and probable that the place that they're at when the messenger came was Bethel. And so the Bethel became known at this stage here as a place of weeping, which is sad, actually, because Bethel means house of God. So the house of God got turned into a place of weeping and sorrow for the sins that the Israelites had then committed. So the first fill in the blank there, they're obviously not coming up on the overhead. It said, when we see God remind the people that he brought them out of Egypt, he's reminding them of the covenant that he made with them. So anytime in Old Testament you see that God say, I am the one who brought you out of Egypt, that's him reminding them of the covenant he's made with them, which is, if you do these things, I will be your God and you will be my people. And so he leads with that because, of course, he's about to say, you broke your covenant with me. One other thing to point out is that this covenant, God refers to it as my covenant, not our covenant. It's my covenant because he is the superior in the relationship. This is the way that even a king who was making a covenant with a lesser king would speak to them. This is not our covenant. This is my covenant. This is a covenant that we have not earned. This is a covenant the Israelites had not earned. They had done nothing to earn this favor from God. And so it's his covenant with them that still had some requirements on their part. And of course, they broke those requirements. So let's go to the next section here of Judges chapter 2, verse 6 to 10. It says, coming back to the narration, previously, when Joshua had sent the people away, the Israelites had gone and to take possession of the land, each to his own inheritance. The people worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime and during the lifetime of the elders who outlived Joshua. They had seen all of the Lord's great works that he had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timoth-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim. Joshua was an Ephraimite, north of Mount Gash. That whole generation was also gathered to their ancestors. After them, another generation rose up who did not know the Lord or the works that he had done for Israel. So it's possible that a portion of what is being talked about here may have happened during that same time as Joshua 24. That if you remember Joshua 24, choose you this day whom you will serve, that stuff during Shechem. It's possible that what is happening here happened during what happened in Joshua 24. And so that should ring in our ears. In fact, several verses here are almost copies of one another in Joshua 24, and in this section of the book of Judges, you can look, and there's some verses that are nearly identical. The author here, though, breaks up the history into 3 generations. If you could put my next slide up, there's 3 generations mentioned here. There's those who witnessed God's work through Joshua. Then there's those who remembered what God did through Joshua. And then there's those who did not know God or his works. So there was the group of people who were alive when Joshua was alive, and they were sort of equal of age or near in age. Then there's the group of people who were possibly young people when Joshua died, and they had seen what God had done with the Israelites and with Joshua at that time, so they remembered it. They were the first generation after Joshua. And then there was their children. A group of people who grew up never knowing Joshua and never experiencing the power of God, because the conquest was done and the people were no longer going and trying to take the land. So they grew up not fighting. They grew up not knowing God's power. They grew up just inheriting what their parents had left them. So we don't want to put the blame on the generation, obviously, the last generation. The only reason the last generation is in this place of not knowing God and not having a relationship with him is the parents didn't take the land. They knew the power of God, but they had fear, and they didn't take the land. And they then didn't pass on to their children faith that God would do according to his word. It's sad. So the fill in the blank here is the transition between the first 2 generations is the death of Joshua. The transition between the second and third one is the death of those who knew Joshua. So there was like first-hand experience, second-hand experience, no experience. And unfortunately, the worship of God seems to have died out with the death of those who had witnessed his mighty acts. So those who were alive during the time of Joshua, or at least near the end of his stage. The next generation grew up surrounded by Canaanites and surrounded by Canaanite gods. And they were distracted by the false gods of the Canaanites. They were distracted by the culture and the practices of the entrenched people of the land, and thought that if we're going to live here, we're going to have to do like what they do. And they were distracted. And their parents, instead of completing the work and driving out the Canaanites, or at least continuing it, they stopped. And so the children did not know how to continue, and they stopped. Really, what we can say is because they didn't drive out the Canaanites, for the parents, it was very difficult to keep alive the memory of the power of God when they weren't practicing it, and when they weren't seeing it, and when they weren't partaking in it. Yes, brother?
That reminds me so easily, today's age, people can come into the position where they would rather go with the norm rather than what is actually rooted from the ancestors.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so easy for us to look around and start thinking that if we're going to be here, we're going to have to act like everybody else around us, and we're going to have to take on the things around us. Or really, I mean, just put it honestly, to get distracted by all the false gods and the false idols that are out there. Not all gods and idols have statues, right?
To kind of connect with that idea is like you have your first generation Pentecostal
Yeah. Sometimes it just gets dropped. Yeah.
Yeah, my parents probably, they were Catholic first, and then they came to the first, or my first, I'm not too sure. But then here I am, like, trying to
Yeah.
keep
Keep it
it
alive.
going.
Yeah.
Then you look down in the States where there's like 5 to 6 generations of the
Yeah.
heritage of this. I was thinking on the same lane as to, like, they witnessed it, they saw the miracles,
Yeah.
they saw what God can do, and then they're trying to talk about it, and like maybe their kids were this age, so that they're still affected, where they could still believe and still know, but then you get distracted, so you start doing these things, and then with those people that are still there, they're going to try to think of the word, but they're going to, I guess, turn your way, or you're going to compromise,
Yeah.
and then there you go. Then there's a third word, like,
Absolutely. I mean, it has to be hard to believe in a God that's only talked about
yeah,
and never experienced.
There's kind of a couple of different things happening here because it's not only, if we aren't witnessing firsthand the mighty works of God, and then it's one thing to hear it, and then but it not being, children not seeing that practiced out in life. And another thing is how God meant what he said. I need you to wipe these people out because how easily it is to be influenced by
Absolutely.
what's going on around you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, brother.
Just to tag on to her statement a little bit deeper, is basically what she was talking about. What we need is, even if there's first, second, third, every generation has to come to revelation themselves. If
Absolutely. Yeah.
take a person that has the revelation and has the experience, you won't be able to shape that person nearly as easily if a person has an experience versus a memory that was foretold.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Because that memory will only be there for so long.
Only so
but
long. Yeah.
an experience will stand there with firm.
Absolutely. And the experience, in this case here, we have the third generation that grows up not knowing God. And it wasn't because they didn't experience it per se, it's because their parents didn't. Even though their parents grew up at the same time as Joshua, they knew of the things of God, they heard all the stories of the things of God that happened, but they didn't go and fight for it themselves. They had somewhat of faith, they believed it, but they didn't put any action behind it. And so their children had it even worse because they had less to hear and no action to see, and they also took no action. Now, Judges itself, again, we can look at this generation, and I think absolutely it's applicable. My overall idea of talking about the book of Judges is for us individually as our entering into salvation, which is what the Israelites received when they entered into the promised land. It's an allegory, if you will, for our individual salvation. And so if that's the case, I put it to you that we can have an experience with God, we can drive things out in our life, and really enjoy that, and just really be amazed at what God has done, and never go beyond, and never progress, and never push. And then, when that's stale, even I would say an individual can forget what God has done in their life, and forget what has happened, and start to put faith in the things around them rather than on God. And I would say that if Peter can see Jesus walking on the water and have faith enough to get out of the boat, right? That's like that initial salvation experience. But then get distracted by the waves around him and then start to sink when Jesus is right in front of him. If Peter can do that, then I definitely can slip in my walk with God and lose faith in ways in my walk with God, which is exactly what happened to the Israelites here. Let's go ahead. Absolutely.
focus on him, because this is the part where a lot of times it's missed to be brought out, I think, is he wasn't thinking until he took his eyes
Until he was distracted. Exactly. Yeah.
taking his eyes off Jesus.
Exactly. And what God is saying to the people here is, I need you to destroy those altars, because if you don't, you will be distracted by them. And if you're distracted by them, you're going to take your eyes off of me. And if you take your eyes off of me, you're going to lose faith and you're not going to get the land. And they didn't obey. Okay, Judges. Let's go to the next. We did this one here, Judges 11:13. Thank you. The Israelites did that which was evil in the Lord's sight. They worshipped the Baals and abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. There it is, right? Remembering there. It's saying here they've abandoned their covenant. They followed other gods from the surrounding peoples and bowed down to them. They angered the Lord, for they abandoned him and worshipped Baal and the Ashtoreths. So the author is starting to lead us up now to the setting of the main book. The main book of Judges starts in chapter 3, verse 7. That's where the book of the judges or the rulers starts. And we're now getting led up to that. The people did which was evil in the Lord's sight. They've abandoned him. They've abandoned everything else. This phrase, the Israelites did that was evil in the sight of the Lord, is taken as a quote right out of the book of Deuteronomy. And this is what the Israelites did in their wilderness walk on the way up to the land of Israel. The word evil here is yara, which again just means poorly made or of little worth. So they did what was of little worth in the sight of God. They did their lives in an amateur way in the sight of God rather than following his path. Here's a fill in the blank for you. Baal and Ashtoreth are used to indicate really a plethora or many false gods served by the people of the land. Baal was a sort of a weather god of the wind and the rain, and therefore, your crops are going to grow. And it took many, many forms. And the Ashtoreths were a god of fertility. So this is super normal for human society. You're going to have a god of some weather or something that brings rain because the farmers need that. So typically when the farmers want some rain, they're going to invent some sort of a god to try and get some rain out of. And you're always going to have some sort of a god of fertility. You want your animals to be having lots of babies and calves and this kind of thing, and you want your families to be plentiful as well. And so there's typically some sort of a god of fertility. Yes? Yeah, so the Baal and the Ashtoreth were used to indicate the plethora of false gods. That's the first one. Served by the people of the land. Baal was a sort of weather god, and Ashtoreth was a sort of god of fertility. Both of these these false gods were routinely imaged in fairly regular ways throughout the land. The Baal was typically some sort of a standing stone, basically a type of a phallic symbol, but just some sort of an obelisk standing stone. That was the Baal. And then the Ashtoreth was typically some sort of a carved figurine type thing with very grotesque features. But again, a god of weather and a god of fertility. And so here the people lost their memory and they lost their sight of God. But the god of this world was literally everywhere. They could see the Baal statues. They could see the figurines of the Ashtoreths, and they were in the high places in all the Canaanite towns. So the god of this world, the false god of this world, was visible to them everywhere, and the worship of this god was visible to them everywhere. And so they got distracted. They bowed down themselves, and they prostrated themselves towards it as if a superior. Now just put yourself in God's shoes for just a moment. These are the people that you've brought up out of Egypt. You've brought through the land, the wilderness for 40 years. You've kept them. You've fed them. You've kept their clothes from wearing out. You've brought them into this land. You've brought them through just absolutely impossible victories, like Jericho and the like. And you literally split the water so that they could just walk across. Like, no waiting for BC ferries. There was no cancellation that day. It opened up, straight across they went. That's who you are. You love these people. And now you look down and you see them bowing down to the very stones and sticks that you created. Just imagine that.
One of the questions I always wonder, was it like plastic or something walls there that people wouldn't be able to get into the water? How was all that?
Oh.
Was it like a big forest?
Who knows? We get to ask God that one when we get there. How was it? Yeah. We know it was the breath of God, so somehow it was just blown away.
No, but I mean that's just the beauty of it.
And I know it's going to be pretty amazing to know that. Let's go to the next slide, please. We're going to read Judges 2, 14, and 15. And therefore, this is God's reaction. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he handed them over to marauders who raided them. He sold them to the enemies around them, and they could no longer resist their enemies. Whenever the Israelites went out, that is, to war, the Lord was against them and brought disaster on them, just as he had promised and sworn to them. So they suffered greatly. So we've got the anger here of the Lord against this backdrop of the grace that he's had towards them and the good favor he's had towards them in bringing them into this land. And this is how they respond, and his emotions drive up inside of him. And so, again, he doesn't destroy them, he doesn't demolish them, but the punishment is fitting of their crime and of their trespass. When they go out to fight, he fights for their enemies. You're not going to win. When they go to do things, he resists them, and he sells them into the hands of their enemies, and they're given over to marauders who raid them, and he doesn't defend them. He leaves it up to themselves. If you want to do things on your own, you have to defend yourself, and I won't be there. This is in contrast to the messenger that's talked about in verse 1 is very probably the same messenger who was the lead of heaven's armies when fighting with Judah throughout the low country and when fighting for the Israelites and defending them when they were in the wilderness. And instead of having that fight for them, they're fought against. And so I want to point out, though, that the gods of the Canaanites and the gods that the Canaanites were worshiping had no bearing on the outcome. They did not help the Canaanites, nor did they hinder them. They didn't help the Israelites, nor did they hinder them. They're just rocks and sticks. They are sticks and stones. That's all they are. It was God who fought against them. So God changed his position from being for the Israelites to being against them. From for to against, because they broke the covenant. I just want to point this out. It's very easy for us to blame the devil or demons or evil forces or something for the things that go wrong in our lives. God is often trying to get our attention and trying to direct our steps a little bit. And if we're wandering, he's going to push us back. Not because he loves punishment. Otherwise, we would be gone in an instant. But because he's trying to get our stubborn heads back in line, remembering that he loves us and that we can rely on him for everything. And we don't have to go do our own thing. We can, we don't have to. So Judges 2, 16 to 19 should be the next one. Lovely. So, now we're getting closer to this idea of the book of Judges. The Lord raised up judges who saved them from the power of their marauders. But they did not listen to their judges. Instead, they prostituted themselves with other gods, bowing down to them. They quickly turned from the way of their ancestors, who walked in obedience to the Lord's commandments. They did not do as their ancestors did. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for the Israelites, The Lord was with him and saved the people from the power of their enemies while the judge was still alive. The Lord was moved to pity whenever they groaned because of those who were oppressing and afflicting them. Whenever the judge died, the Israelites would act even more corruptly than their ancestors, following other gods to serve them and bow in worship to them. They did not turn from their evil practices or their obstinate ways. Notice the language here around walking. The Israelites turned quickly away, while the ancestors walked in obedience. There's always this motion of direction that is used in Scripture poetically. This is why the Christian walk was first referred to as the way, with the definite article. It's the only way, so it is the way. Everywhere else you go is not the way. There's a way that seems right, but it's not the right way. You think of Psalms 1:1, stands in the way of sinners, sits in the seat of the scornful. There's that walking and then down to a sitting. There's just a stop in motion. Because without God, there is no movement towards. There is only death and decay and ending, and no movement towards. That's why that language is constantly used through Scripture. Still and stagnant. Who drinks still and stagnant water? No. What happens in still and stagnant water is it becomes unuseful and full of disease. So though God does use punishment sometimes to guide our path, he always leaves a way to come back to relationship with him. So that's your fill in the blank. God does use punishment to guide our path, but he always leaves a way. I think I said, maybe last Sunday, when I said living for God's like is like living life with the bumpers up on the bowling lane. Sometimes you bounce back and forth off of them. And that's kind of what punishment is. Yes? Okay. Had no bearing on the outcome. God changed his position from being for the Israelites to being against them. No problem. You only get a half point for that one, though. On the pop quiz. So God always leaves a way to come back in relationship with him. That's the beautiful thing about it, is that he does use some punishment. It's always to get our direction, though. This set of verses here, though, explains the same thing in two different ways in a sort of classic A-B pattern in Scripture, where you have the same thing described twice. God raised up leaders for Israel. They responded by not listening. A, B. God was moved to pity when he's seen their oppression, so he raised up another leader and freed them from their oppressors, and eventually they returned to their evil ways again. The reason it's doing this is it's trying to show you that there's a bit of a cycle going on. There's a cycle. And it's a rut that they can't get out of. But we also see in the Scripture the purpose of the leaders that God raises up, right? Why does he raise up these people? It says the Lord raised up judges who would save them from the power of their marauders. The Lord was moved to pity, and he would raise them up, and he would release them from those who were oppressing them. But then the Israelites would turn back. So now we get to understand a little bit of what these rulers and leaders were for. They were for to save them, to get them out of the position they were in, to save them from their oppression. Again, not because they earned it, but it says, but God was moved to pity. It was moved to pity. That word moved to pity is the word nacham, and it means, in its root form, it means to breathe deeply. And when I heard that, I instantly just felt like a sigh. Like, I got to do something. Figuratively, this word means regret, or to become remorseful, or to change your mind about something. We have a bit of an inside joke in our family around the sigh, because Anzo and Elias now have adopted the Mikhailo sigh, of we have this great little video clip of him when he was 2 years old with the sigh. It's been there for a long time. And so that's what came to my mind. Obviously, this is quite an intense thing, but it's still the funny thing that came to my mind. He was moved to pity. He changed his mind about the punishment that they were being given, seeing perhaps they were maybe learning their lesson. His idea and his goal here, of course, is not to wipe the Israelites out, but it's to try and bring them back into alignment with him in coming to that the way. And so, but instead we see this spiral of sin and evil that they're coming into. Yes?
One of the things that I found very interesting is if Moses and God came on the same page at the same time, then the Israelites would have been like numerous.
You're talking about that, yeah, when God would say, I'm going to wipe the people out, and Moses stood in the way. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, God repented that he had done this or had done that. And yeah, if thank God they didn't. That's all I can say. Another way to kind of render this, actually, to render this text here would be the Lord was with the ruler or the judge, and the Lord rescued them. I think I have this up. Mikhailo, could you put to the next slide? Because I think it has this rendering in there. No, it doesn't. It has a. Go to the next one. That's because I haven't gotten to it yet. Sorry, next one. There we go. Thank you. The Lord was with the ruler, and he, the Lord, rescued them from the hand of their enemies as long as the ruler lived. For he changed his mind concerning the calamity, or the punishment, on account of their groaning, because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. So even in that punishment while it was happening, he would step in. He didn't want those who were doing the punishing to kind of get their heads out of whack as to what was actually going on here. And he didn't want the Israelites destroyed, but just brought back in alignment. And so at the same time, he would raise up a leader to sort of say, guys, come back, come back. This is the way and the truth and the light. This is the correct area, and where you're going is an opposite way to that.
Just something I'm thinking of, like, the response of their groaning, God having pity on them. Was it more of, like, because you know how in Psalms how it talks about how they cried unto the Lord and then he had mercy on them?
Yeah.
Was their groaning even really directed towards God, or was it just a groaning like, we're being afflicted and we're...
Yeah, actually, the word here is more applicable to the groanings and what they dealt with and how they reacted to their slavery in Egypt. It's the closest parallel, really, in terms of this language. Now, we'll go through the book of Judges, and we'll see all the little instances in which they did or did not cry out to God. But for this characterization, it's better to kind of parallel it with their slavery in Egypt and their groanings and the way that they reacted to that versus anything else. And you're right. We can go back one slide, Mikhailo, and I had already done that. The word is nahem and means to breathe deeply, and is used figuratively to mean to become remorseful or to change your mind. And so that's that word translated move to pity, nahem. Now, one of the things here is that this collection of scripture we just read there, 6 to 19, describes the word that they prostituted themselves. And actually that makes sense in two ways. First of all, God's covenant with his people is often compared to or contrasted with a marriage. And so the idea of somebody leaving the marriage and prostituting themselves is something that people can understand, and we can grasp that, and we can know what that means. And we can therefore feel some of that hurt. The next is that the gods that the Israelites were going after were fertility gods, and so sometimes were worshipped in that way. And so this word is used specifically. It means something almost literally, but a lot figuratively, and that word is used throughout Judges, but also the major and minor prophets as we move on. It talks about the Israelites prostituting themselves after other gods. And again, it's because of the violation of that that covenant. Okay, Judges. Actually, go to the next slide. And one more. One more. There we go. 20 and 23. Okay. Good. I'm going to read this here. Judges 2 and 20. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he declared, because this nation has violated my covenant that I have made with their ancestors and disobeyed me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I did this to test Israel, to see whether or not they would keep the Lord's way, by walking in it, as their ancestors had. The Lord left these nations and did not drive them out immediately. He did not hand them over to Joshua. So this basically summarizes and reiterates verses 14 and 19, said again from a different perspective, but it's said specifically from God's perspective. You'll note that there's quotes around this, quoting God and the statements he's making out of his anger that burned. His accusation, of course, is to the nation of Israel. And I want you to note something, and this is a fill in the blank. He refers to Israel in verse 20 as not as my people, but as this nation. So you can see in the English that it's very clear. Wow, that's not just like that's like Adam going from my wife to this woman, right? Yeah. So God says, not my people, this is now this nation. But also, the word in the Hebrew that's used here is goy. And goy is used in the Hebrew when they speak of the nations, particularly when they're referring to the Gentiles. So an Israelite would use this word goy to talk about the other, the secular other, the unholy, not of the family of God, other. And in fact, this term is still used today sometimes as a derogatory term for non-Jewish people. I was actually called this when I was in Israel. A goy. Yeah. And it's this, though, is one of the very rare occurrences in the Bible where this word is used to speak of the Israelites. Very rarely used, but it's a word of dissociation. Like basically he's saying, I can't tell the difference right now between what's supposed to be my people and these Canaanites. They're the same. He's angry. He's frustrated. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I tell you what, I'd be frustrated, that is for sure. So he said, I will not go before them. In fact, none of the battles that are described in the rest of this book are actually about the acquisition of land. The battles in this book are all about protection and defense and trying to not get killed. But there is no battle in the book of Judges that is about moving into and taking land that they were given and doing what they were supposed to have done. They're all defensive. And so what God is saying is I'm not helping these people move in to the land that Joshua did not take. They are basically only to throw off the yoke of bondage that was put on them by the Canaanites. The reference to Joshua, of course, reminds us that even though Israel had a powerful leader, not even he could take over the land unless God gave it to him and worked with him. Okay, you can go two ahead. My people, but as this nation. All right, next. This here is a little diagram that I've put together that shows the actions and the patterns of the Israelites on the left and God's sort of response to that on the right-hand side. I'm not really sure how readable it is, but it's the apostasy turns into oppression, which turns into groaning, which then receives deliverance, but then they slip back into apostasy again. From God's perspective, it's anger and then punishment and then a change of mind, giving deliverance to the Israelites, and then angry again at their apostasy. This is what we can kind of call the rut of apostasy, which is basically going back to false gods and worshiping the wrong God. It's a rut. And I like the idea of a rut because when you get into a rut, you're not going anywhere. You're just spinning your wheels. Yeah. Which, of course, they had no idea what spinning your wheels was, because it's not like they had driven wheels back then, did they? Unless they had a really fast chariot. Maybe those chariots of iron. Okay, let's now move on to Judges 3, 1-6, and bring this to a close. These are the nations the Lord left in order to test all of those in Israel who had experienced none of the wars in Canaan. So the third generation that we've been talking about. This was to teach the future generations of Israel how to fight in battle, especially those who had not fought before. These nations included 5 rulers of the Philistines and all of the Canaanites, the Zidonians, and the Hivites, who lived in the Lebanese mountains from Mount Baal Harmon as far as the entrance to Hamath. The Lord left them to test Israel, to determine if they would keep the Lord's commandments that he had given their ancestors through Moses. But they settled among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The Israelites took their daughters as wives for themselves, gave their own daughters to their sons, and worshipped their gods. Wow. So that phrase there in the first sentence, the wars of Canaan, that's of course referring to the holy war of conquest that had started under Joshua in this land, under the direction of God. After they fought for and conquered some of the land, they left quite a bit of it unconquered and undealt with. And after so the next generation didn't do anything with the rest of the land, and God was not going to drive them out. Interestingly here, interesting for guys like me, I think, this is the first time the Philistines are showing up, which is, if you grow up like me reading Samuel and Kings and the story of David, the Philistines are really prominent there. The Philistines, though, are not native to this area. They're not ethnically from this area. And in fact, they are just coming into this area from around the Mediterranean. There are some archaeologists believe they came as far as perhaps even the British Isles. There's a whole thing that you could go and spend hours reading and studying on called the Bronze Age collapse, which the Philistines were a major part of. And they destroyed the Bronze Age superpowers of the era during this time. And they showed up on the scene there in what we call Palestine today, and set themselves up as a kingdom. They had 5 kings, it says here. And so not only do the Israelites have all these locals to deal with, now they have an invasive tribe of intensely good, never mind your chariots of iron type stuff, intensely good fighters in the Philistines to have to deal with. And they're going to have to deal with it with their little Baals and their Asteriths because they don't think God can help them out. We're setting the scene for what is going to be Judges and then move into the story of David and Saul. Yes? I don't think so. Did he comment? Okay. Way to throw me off, man. I'm just joking. Yeah, we have some great reliefs in Egypt showing their conquest of Egypt. They're just coming in, ravishing the land, taking what they want and leaving. Yeah, a little bit like a lot of people try and say that they were like the Vikings of their time. Yeah, which is what leads some scholars to believe they came from around, that sort of Nordic or at least British Isles area. But who knows? They could have come from Italy and some of that area. But it was quite interesting. The Bronze Age collapse is infinitely interesting and full of questions. Okay, these struggles, though, fill in the blank. Do we have a fill in the blank, Makala? Is there another slide? Yeah, 2 ahead. These struggles were to test the people to see if they would turn when under threat. And we quickly see that they fail this test. They settle among the people, they integrate with the people, and then they start to serve their gods. So they lose all of their distinction. They don't do what God's told them to do at all, and they end up serving their gods. And now we know the setting for the book of Judges. Now we get to move into the stories and the people and the stories of the individual rulers who tried to help Israel get back to a good standing with God. One might be surprised, to be honest, that God is even caring about working with these people at this state after everything that they've done, and how blasphemous they have been, and how callous and silly they have been. But I think that speaks more to God's mercy and grace than anything else. And I know there's a lot of people who try and interpret the scriptures as God in the Old Testament was this big, mean, nasty, dark force. But if they do that, it's because they do not understand the rest of the world at the time. And so when God's punishing them instead of wiping them out, that's a big deal. He's trying to say, come back. I've brought you to this place. Come back to this place. And he didn't destroy them.